So I don't know if you heard, but the ADL has come out recently, guns a-blazing at anti-Zionist groups, specifically Jewish anti-Zionist groups, focusing its efforts on fighting leftist progressives now. A article from Jewish Currents, written by Marie Cohen and Isaac Schur on May 1st, says the ADL doubles down on opposing the anti-Zionist left. CEO Jonathan Greenblatt argued that Palestine solidarity groups are, quote, the photo inverse of the extreme right, and promised that fighting them would become more central to his mission. This individual, ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt, delivered one of the more unhinged speeches that I've seen in recent times, and we lived through a Trump presidency. This guy, I mean, he looks like a hard-boiled egg in a suit, truly. He looks one of, I don't know, I don't want to keep making fun of his appearance, but he looks bad. I'll put up a picture.
But you have to.
Yeah.
You have to. But he's asking for it.
But he looks like Mr. Potato Head if he had less features. Okay, so the ADL now considers Palestine solidarity groups, Jewish Voice for Peace, and Students for Justice in Palestine, as well as Muslim civil rights organization, Council for American Islamic Relations, also known as CARE, to be, quote, extremists because of their anti-Zionist advocacy. Greenblatt announced at the organization's annual National Leadership Summit. Speaking into a camera in a pre-recorded speech, Greenblatt said, quote, SJP, JVP, CARE, and DARE. No, I'm just kidding. Epitomize the radical left, the photo inverse of the extreme right that the ADL has long tracked. Hey, if we're the photo inverse, doesn't that mean that we're anti-fascist? Isn't that what that means? Like, because you're talking about fascists and then reverse it, anti. So the ADL plans to apply, quote, more concentrated energy toward the threat of radical anti-Zionism. Though the organization has long maintained that anti-Zionism isn't necessarily anti-Semitic, as noted in its online glossary, Greenblatt rejected that view on screen. He said that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, calling anti-Zionism an ideology rooted in rage, predicated on one concept, the negation of another people. Surprisingly, the ADL did not respond to questions from Jewish Currents at the time the article was published. Look, we all know what the ADL is, right? The ADL is a propagandist lobby that works to undermine anybody who is threatening occupation at large. They are anti-BDS. They have a long history of surveilling and working with police, the program where police officers go to train in the occupation and learn anti-terror tactics that are then brought back to cities in the United States, is a program that's under their supervision. And there was a leaked memo recently that showed that they're aware of the growing public pressure to stop that program. They don't want to be perceived as being close with the police, but that's what they are. They want to paint themselves as like this civil rights and civil advocacy group for Jews, just fighting the good fight of anti-Semitism, when in fact they are actually an oppressive organization that has facilitated spying and occupation-like policing, as well as maligning various causes and people who are associated with Palestine and Palestine solidarity work. So the fact that they're like, well, we're really going to start fucking looking for you now. It's like, what have you been doing? How will we know the difference?
Very true.
So as early as the 1930s, supported by strong elite provoked anti-communist sentiment, the ADL began carrying out surveillance against movement organizations like the National Lawyers Guild, reporting their activities to the House Committee on Un-American Activities. They ramped up their activities during the McCarthy era as the ADL became a proxy for the U.S. government, working as a private spy agency, feeding information to the FBI. The ADL's monitoring of popular organizations continued after the McCarthy period, showing continuities in its use as a tool of U.S. government repression. That surveillance has included spying on the Black Freedom Movement, including Martin Luther King Jr., anti-apartheid activists, and organizers for Palestinian rights. In 1993, the San Francisco District Attorney investigated the ADL for collecting confidential information on nearly 10,000 activists in at least 700 organizations. The investigation showed that the ADL had directly surveilled and infiltrated social justice and human rights organizations in at least 7 cities, and its agents had received stolen police files from a surveillance program deemed illegal. The ADL had collected information on groups opposing South African apartheid and U.S. racism, including the United Farm Workers, the Vanguard Public Foundation, the San Francisco Labor Council, AFL-CIO, NAACP, MADRE, Greenpeace, and the Center for Constitutional Rights. It also heavily targeted surveillance at Arab groups, keeping files on 4,500 members of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee and Jewish peace groups. Furthermore, the ADL agents supplied confidential information to foreign governments, including Israel and South Africa. Over a 40-year period, that private investigator hired by the Jewish Defense League also independently received money from a South African intelligence agent to provide information on South African exiles and anti-apartheid activists to the white South African apartheid government. The ADL's surveillance mapped closely to acts of violence against Arab American and South African activists. The ADL's infiltrator, Roy Bullock, was a regular volunteer at San Francisco's ADC and often worked on security at the time that Alex O'Day, the office's director, was murdered by a bomb planted at the office door. Bullock had reported to South African government on the California visit of activist Chris Hani just before he returned to South Africa and was killed. Throughout the ADL's history, it has used terms extremist and fascist to describe communist, black liberationists, white supremacists, guerrillas from Central America to Asia, Palestinian popular resistance movements, and U.S. supporters of boycotting Israel, all of whom the ADL has opposed under the banner of championing civil rights. The ADL's opposition to the left framed its work. ADL research director Irwan Sual asserted in the early 1990s, "It's the American left that's the biggest threat to American Jews." In 1992, FBI agents noticed that some of their intelligence on the Nation of Islam had appeared in an article written by ADL staff. A few months later, they raided the ADL's office. Along with classified FBI data, they also found that the ADL had a much larger collection of illegal files. A set of dossiers on activist groups had been acquired from the San Francisco Police Department's surveillance unit, which had been shut down in 1990 as unconstitutional. Files had been ordered destroyed, but went secretly to the ADL. There were files from other cities' police departments as well. In the present, the ADL has continued to push back against internationalist, intersectional anti-racism and has used its status as the nation's premier civil rights organization to do so. In a particularly painful example, in 2016, the ADL's director wrote a critique of the Movement for Black Lives policy platform using the Black spiritual phrasing of the civil rights movement. He told them to set aside intersectional bonds with Palestinian resistance and instead keep our eyes on the prize. At the same time, the ADL has consistently used the language of civil rights and its position as an authority on them to describe Israeli state military violence as liberatory and Palestinian resistance, including nonviolent civil resistance, as extremist. This habit isn't incidental. The ADL is now a vetter of content for YouTube, where videos relating to the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement have been censored as hate speech. ADL has also reportedly joined forces with Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft to, quote, engineer solutions to cyber hate and is building a Silicon Valley command center to house these operations. As Arab American communities were being disenfranchised by the ADL, they were also being subjected to intense violence. In 1986, former Michigan House member and civil rights activist John Conyers called it a national tragedy and convened a federal hearing. The hearing was one in a series of hate crime hearings on anti-Black and anti-gay violence between 1980 and 1988. All three noted its political and dispossessive nature, directed at individuals engaged in public life, asserting Black, queer, and Arab issues as rightful concerns of the larger communities in which they shared. In each case, violence was so often unaddressed by law enforcement that groups found the state complicit. The violence described in the Arab American hearing was catastrophic and heavy with messaging. Bombings, murders, and assaults on Arab and Muslim community groups had been carried out in every part of the United States. Witnesses laid out how closely anti-Arab violence was integrated with the ADL's delegitimization of Arab citizenship and membership in U.S. political sphere. The bombings, fires, and murders followed where the ADL and AIPAC had vilified Arab Americans. Arabs had been frozen out of political power structures. Arabs' inability to leverage political responses to the violence against them, the FBI's failure to prosecute any case, and the success of the ADL and its partners in casting anti-Arab violence as a rational response to Arab American politics often, quote, succeeded in terrorizing the victims into submission. And this is a part of why, like, a lot of the older generation is opposed to getting involved in politics. A lot of the older generation of Palestinians are tired and scared, and they've seen people die. They've seen people be maligned. They've seen campaigns levied against them to have them lose their job, their home, all of their standing in the community. It's a campaign that is chilling people's political speech and engagement on the issue of Palestine. So anyways, they're saying that they want to turn up the heat, and we are ready for all of the smoke.
I feel like the ADL is really irrelevant. It feels like the old wave of Zionism, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like the new wave of Zionism is just to pretend that Zionism is cool.
Totally. Like a progressive thing. The new wave of Zionists is like, we're actually the native progressive people. And then the old wave of Zionism is like, anybody who says anything about Israel is an anti-Semite.
Right.
And sometimes they mix and match, you know, but
and sometimes they mix. Exactly.
Largely it is like new Twitter users who are like, don't dead name Palestine.
Yeah, but I still don't get that.
It's so funny to me that they're like, no, you can't call Israel by its old name, right? Like Palestine's an old name. That's why we got to call it Judea and Sumeria.
Right. The new wave of Zionism is like I am Zionist. Hear me roar.
Or like, I am Zionism. I'm indigenous to hummus. You know what I mean? Like, that's their vibe. Palestine pod.